Welcome to the class. I'm really glad you're choosing to spend your Saturday doing this as opposed to a number of other probably more healthy activities. But at least this is relaxing. Man, I had one of my first shows in a long time last night. I played outside at a pizza place, and I think we made like $19. Great pizza, some good brews, and just great stuff. We did a lot of blues songs, a lot of, in fact, I'll show you a quick clip of it here. Let me do a screen share.
You're such a dumbass.
Anyhow, I had more fun than a monkey with a peanut machine. The problem is they kept buying us beer, which happens at a pizza place, so I had to have 3 extra cups of coffee this morning. Hopefully that will be obvious. This class is going to be a fun one because, man, there's a lot of scales out there. There's more scales than on a 15-foot python. When I started researching this, I went, holy cow, how am I going to talk about all these? So to allay your concern, I'm going to skip ahead real quick to page 2, item 3. And remember that, circle that item, because this class will probably overwhelm you. Keep reminding yourself that all you really need to know is that item 3, the 5 must-have scales, okay? All this other stuff is just to expand your brain, okay? And then on the last page of the syllabus, I give out scale formulas, and that's another intimidating looking diagram. Just take a peek at page 3. It's the addendum of the class. It says scale formulas. So I don't think I even counted these. Probably 30, 40 scales there. Once again, way more scales than you'll ever need, but some of these are pretty exotic. Remember, as you're going through these formulas, just keep remembering there's 5 of them that you really just need for now, okay? So let's dive right in. And I was trying to think of what's the most simple way to explain a scale, like the absolute most caveman way to explain a scale. And I came up with the idea, it's like beads on a string. It's just a way to organize and store your notes for future use. So you can see by this graphic here, the notes are the black dots. They go up and then they go down. And in most scales, as we'll talk about in a few minutes here, the notes are either farther apart, or a whole tone, or closer together, which is a half tone. So this is like your major scale. It's got the whole, half, whole, half kind of thing going on. And then if you were to do all whole tones, it would look like that. In other words, some scales that we'll discuss in a minute are built of further spaced notes, further apart beads on the string. And then some would be the chromatic scale, where the beads are very close on the string. So it's a really good metaphor just to think of their notes, beads on a string. Some are far apart, some are closer. Some strings of beads have 5 beads on them, some have 12, but they're all just a collection of notes. Now, this class, here's another disclaimer, is primarily a theory class. It's going to be a bit dense, so have your pens ready. A lot of my other workshops are more about the practical, let's have fun and jam with them. So one more reference, I'm not going to talk a lot about how to use the scales to turn into music in this class. Those of you who work with me know I'm a big fan of that. So if you have your G scale, I spend a lot of time teaching how to turn that into this. And how to turn the scale into music. That is covered in the workshop on the JamAlong YouTube channel in the class called How to Improvise. So I will point you to that if you haven't watched it, if you want to take this a step further, okay? Let's talk about the parameters of a scale. Basically, the box that a scale lives in is 2 things, the octave and the spacing of the notes. So basically, simply put, the octave is kind of a cosmic idea where if you ascend far enough, at some point, you'll encounter the same note you started with, but higher up. Now, we take that for granted, but when you kind of unpack that, it gets a bit Yoda. So if I'm playing a G scale, at the top, the 8th, and the bottom, the 1st, it's the same note. They consider that to be the same note when any logical person would say, no, these are 2 different notes. That's way higher. So I can't explain why, but when you get 12 halftones, or at the top of a major scale, 8 notes, you have the octave. So that's in pretty much most of Western music the highest and lowest we have for a scale. That's our box we put it in. Now there are scales in some other cultures that I'm not touching on too much in this class that go beyond the octave and have a different series past that, but I'm staying within the octave in this class. That's most scales in the world. And then spacing, that's the beads on the string idea. You can either have notes that are further apart or closer together. Okay, so it's really handy to think of the two dimensions of these scales. These beads on a string are just the octave is the box, and the spacing is what makes the scale the scale. That's the parameters. Now, how many notes should a scale have? Most scales have 7 notes, and the fancy Greek term is heptatonic, hepta being 7 and tonic being notes. Now, I don't know how useful that information is going to be unless you want to nerd out or something, but it's fun to know. Most scales are heptatonic scales or 7-note scales. Almost all of them, okay? Then we have a series of scales called the pentatonic. That's number item 2 under B, and those have 5 notes, penta being 5. We have, those are the main ones, are the heptatonic and the pentatonic scales are primarily what we encounter throughout our life. There are others. There's the hexatonic, which has 6 notes. That's the whole tone scale, which I'll unpack here in a minute. And then the octatonic has 8 notes. That's a diminished scale, which is a really odd combination of half and whole tones. And finally, the chromatic, chroma for color, all colors, all 12 notes. So if you were to take all available notes inside of the octave, you'd have this. And whether or not that's useful depends on your philosophy of music and how jazzy you can tolerate it. We'll touch on that toward the end of the class here. Now, let's go to C under B under 1, the half tone, whole tone mix. Some of you who were traumatized early on by piano lessons probably have this beaten into your brain of having to memorize whole tone, half tone, whole tone, whole tone, half tone, whole, half, whole, half. And that's basically the formula of what combination of far-spaced beads and close-spaced beads make our scale. So the standard mix for the major scale is whole, half, whole, half, as indicated by the W's for whole and H's for half on your chart. The minor is whole, half, whole, half, whole. Now, once again, like I said at the onset, this is kind of a theory-heavy class. And so I'm covering it so I'll be legit, and other teachers on YouTube won't be, throwing shade on me. I have to cover my bases. I'm not saying it's useful necessarily in a jam session. This is more head knowledge today. Okay? The chromatic is all H, obviously, half, all the way up. And the whole tone scale is all whole tones. So once again, it's interesting to note that most scales are a random combination of whole tones or big steps, half tones or small steps, like whole, half, whole, half makes your major scale. But you could technically say, what would happen if I only used whole steps? Then we would get this. It's called a synthetic scale. It sounds kind of odd and unnatural, but it technically is a scale. If we do all whole tones, we get this. And you can see right away that it's real kind of odd, and it floats, and it doesn't really have a root or a grounding feeling to it, which brings up an interesting concept. If you build scales out of even combinations, either all half tones or all whole tones, or like the diminished scale, which goes alternating whole and half, very symmetrical, we have this. It also sounds floaty and weird. So the micro philosophy lesson here is that the things that sound good in music are often non-symmetrical and don't visually or logically make sense, where if you were to construct a scale that looked perfect on paper, it tends to sound very strange. Now, I can't go much deeper into that because I'm not a philosopher necessarily, but that's interesting to note. So now we're going to go to item 2, talk about the basic scale types, okay? These are the families of scales. This is actually really good to know because often you wonder, like, how many scales are out there? There's too much to learn. How do I get my head around this? If you know the different families, you know that there's really, it can be minimized down to an understandable chunk. So we have the major family, the minor family, the major scale, only one of them, the minor family, the pentatonic, and then the modes. And finally, we have what are called synthetic scales, and then we have what I call exotic scales, which are not found a lot, but are fun sometimes. So basically, if you take a mental note that all that's really out there is major scales, minor scales, pentatonic scales, modes, synthetic scales, and sometimes exotic scales. That's the overall tribes of these scales. Now we're going to break down each of those, okay? So, the major scale, the one that we, by the way, use as the basis for all analysis in Western music theory. So, for example, when you look at those formulas on page 3 on the addendum, just remember that those are altered versions of the major scale. We use the major scale as our template. That's what if I tell you I want a scale to go 1, 2, flat 3, 5, you're going to go, okay, so I'm going to take a major scale and flat that normally major third. So that's going to be the template. That's why we put that first. Not because this necessarily sounds better than the others, but it's accepted is the scale that's the workhorse. Now, you'll notice there's only one of them. There's only one major scale. That's it. The minor scales actually have a number of variations, which is fascinating to me. We have one major scale, and once again in most of Western music, but we have technically 3 different minor scales, or actually 4. Let's go over those. We have number 1 under 2, the natural minor. Okay, this is the most common minor scale. The formula is on page 3 once again, which will say 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, natural 7, and then 1 again or 8. That's your standard, sad, soft-sounding minor scale that is generally taught for all like piano students to learn that, the major and the minor scale. A lot of people never go further than that. They have their major scale, their natural minor, and that's it. They have the dark and the light, You hear about what happened to the natural minor scale that went to a bar? The bartender said, sorry, we don't serve minors here. The harmonic minor scale is basically the natural minor scale where we raise the 7th degree. And that's used a lot in classical music, and you can hear it sounds more exotic. So I'll demonstrate. Here's our natural minor scale. Now if I count those intervals, which is a good habit, and find my 7th tone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that has to be raised, meaning go up a fret, okay, in banjo bonics. Now listen to how it sounds. It's definitely more dramatic. You can see why classical composers like to compose with that. Where the natural minor is found more in folk music and like Renaissance music and older forms. A lot of Baroque music and classical and even modern uses the harmonic minor, okay? Because then they can do stuff like this. Organ music, it has to have that sharp 7 in there, and then later on we'll talk about why that also affects the chords on that scale in the later sections of this class. Then we have kind of a dinosaur. I had to add it because once again I'll have people throwing hate on YouTube if I miss it out because it technically exists but no one uses it. It's called a melodic minor. There's 2 versions of it too. There's what's called a classical melodic minor, and then there's what's called the jazz melodic minor. So the classical melodic minor does a very controversial thing. It ascends in a different fashion than it descends. So it ascends as a major scale with just a flat third. That's the only difference. Everything's happy after that. So 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, happy major 6, major 7, 1, which is a weird thing. But then it descends as a natural minor, which is kind of controversial because most scales honestly should ascend and descend in the same fashion. That's kind of a dinosaur. You don't see it a lot. It's more like a invention of theory. There's a whole bunch of theory on why it should do that, but it is so poofy-haired, pipe-smoking person stuff that I don't even want to go there, okay? Now, there is something called the jazz melodic minor. And what that does is that just keeps the normal ascending classical minor. So the jazz melodic minor just flats the 3 of a major scale. Once again, it's a weird hybrid and people don't use it, but I had to include it, okay? So for all purposes, we just need to know that there's the natural minor, which by the way is also known as the relative minor. Also the most popular dating pool in the Deep South. And then the Aeolian is another nickname for that same scale. And that's a mode, and we'll cover modes coming right up. So if you just remember, there's 2 minor scales, that's all we need for now. The natural minor and the harmonic minor, which is fun to improvise with, actually. If I'm playing something that goes G minor to D7, like a gypsy piece, like a Django song, I'm going to pull out the harmonic minor scale. It has more drama to it. I'm going to go... To me, it just has more flavor in there, because that's sharp 7. Now, let's talk about item C under 2, the pentatonic scales. These are 5-note scales. So what's interesting is you take your regular, full, good old happy major scale and we take out notes. So here's a fun exercise, and take a note of this. I want you to try this exercise on your own. You're going to pick any major scale of your choosing, and you're going to make sure you know how to play it, like a G major scale. And then you're going to remove the 4th and the 7th degrees. And notice how the flavor changes. That turns it into a pentatonic scale. So watch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Now I'm going to take out 4 and 7. 1, 2, 3, skip 4, go to 5, 6, skip 7, go to 1. It's way more happy and floaty and fluffy all of a sudden. It sounds like this now. That's a G major pentatonic scale. As you can guess, it's actually really useful for folk music and bluegrass because, to be honest, the major scale is kind of dorky. It's kind of better for Christmas carols than anything else, I mean, because after a while, that sounds a little stiff and like you're practicing scales, but the pentatonic scale, to me, it just sounds it's more conducive to improvisation. Keep that in mind. Then we have the minor pentatonic scale. Now we take a natural minor scale and remove the 2nd and the 6th. And we have the sad version of the pentatonic scale. So once again, the template now is going to be the natural minor scale. I'm going to count and remove 2 and 6 now. 1, 2, 3, I'm sorry. 1, skip 2, 3, 4, 5, skip 6, flat 7, 1. And now we get probably one of the most useful scales you'll ever encounter, the minor pentatonic scale, which is also known by non-theory people as a blues scale. Okay, just know, when a lot of people say blues scale, they really mean the minor pentatonic scale. And that is 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 1. Oh, dude, so much mountain music. Oh, brother, we're out. All that stuff. That's the minor pentatonic scale. It's such an important flavor for like mountain music and blues. It's very important. So that's one of the must-have scales. Then we have the blues scales, and I added that in as a second category because there's something called the modern blues scale. So if you take a minor pentatonic, which sounds pretty bluesy, I can get through the night playing that at a blues gig. However, if we add in two very mean and jazzy notes, the flat 5 and the sharp 7, okay, and that's, once again, that formula is on the third page, you have this: 1, 3, 4, flat 5, 5, natural 7, sharp 7, and then the octave. And all of a sudden, we have a much meaner, bluesier sounding creature. Now we have this. Ooh, yeah. So I call it the modern blues scale. There's other names for it. The reason that works, think about this. The sharp 7 is what's called the leading tone in classical music theory, meaning that if you play a major scale and stop there, it's so unfinished. It wants to lead, it wants to pull back to the key. There's an old joke that when Johann Sebastian Bach was taking a nap in his study, his students would sneak in, go to his piano and play this. And he'd invariably get up and have to go over and plink the last note. It would wake him up. The leading tone has so much tension that it wants to pull back to the key. So we're adding that into our blues scale now. But we have the flat 7 too. We have both. Much more options for expression. I saved the best for last. The flat 5th that we add in there is one of the most controversial tones in the history of music. Also known as El Diabolus in Musica, or the devil in music. The devil's note. The tritone. Okay? If you listen to it by itself, it's rather unnerving, and it's supposed to be. If I play the root and take my 5th and flat it and go back and forth, it's like every alarm or siren or horror movie scene. It's the devil's note. It interestingly enough, it takes the octave. No. And if you measure the octave and cut it exactly in half, that's where the devil's note lives. Once again, an interesting perspective on how even measurements don't sound good. They sound scary. Okay? There's the... So if we take that note and put it into the blues scale, we've now harnessed the dark power of the great dark one into our blues scale, and it gives us this sound. See, by itself, it's just scary, but combined with the 4, in fact, take a note of this. One of the most bluesiest phrases on the planet is flat 5, 4, flat 3, 1. You can practice that on your instrument too. So you're going to go, that's like the bluesiest phrase. And some people will bend from that down to the 4. Another huge cliche in blues players. That's why that sounds good. It's that flat 5th resolving to the 4th. So the modern blues scale is another really handy one to have. The formula is on page 3. Now, as in much of Western culture, we like to have the bad guy with the white hat and the... I'm dyslexic today. You know what I mean. He's got the black hat and the good guy's got the white hat. And we have up and down, hot and cold, good and bad, major and minor. However, if you consider major happy, which is a good characterization, and minor sad, there's a lot of shades in between those. It's just not taught frequently, and these are called the modes. I consider them shades of gray between like the dark, black minor sound and the bright, happy, light major sound. These are the flavors in between. I'm probably going to do a whole class on modes because it's so fascinating, but let's talk about D under 2. Basically, there's more modes out there, but these are the ones that kind of are going to appear in your life at some point. The Mixolydian mode. This, again, is one you should learn. It's also been known as the country scale, or some people call it the bluegrass scale. It basically takes a major scale and flats the 7. And those of you who've done theory with me, and by the way, if you want to know more about that, there's a workshop, Understanding Music Theory, on the JamAlong YouTube channel as well, and that will explain the flat 7 phenomenon. I'm just going to touch on it briefly now. So if you take your major scale and you flat that 7. It's bluesy sounding all of a sudden. It just so happens to be the note that you add into a regular chord to make it a 7th chord. So if I have a G chord, and I add that flat 7, voila, I've got a G7 chord. And so at some point, some musician was like, well, I don't like that sharp 7. I'm going to put flat it. And all of a sudden you have a happy major scale. Pretty happy, but all of a sudden when you get to that 7th degree, now we get bluesy. So it actually, I think, makes the major scale a lot more useful for all of us because it doesn't have that dorky sharp 7 in there. So we should all learn how to take a major scale and flat the 7 and thereby have a Mixolydian scale. Legally, it's a major scale because it's got that major third in there. A little point to remember, the only thing that makes a scale or a chord major or minor is the third, the interval of the third. If it's natural, it's major, and if it's flatted, it's minor. Okay? Same with scales or chords. So think about songs like this. Oh, Joe Clark. What makes that is we go, oh, Joe Clark, that's the flat 7, was a good old man, but there's the major third. He never did no harm. He said he would not pull my corn, might hurt his fiddling arm. Classic example of why you need the Mixolydian scale in your life. It's what almost all of bluegrass is based on. Okay, now let's talk about the Dorian minor. A lot of minor folk songs like Shady Grove or, oh gosh, I can think of so many of them. They're actually based in the Dorian mode. And so that takes a minor scale and raises the 6th back up, a natural minor. So once again, the template is a natural minor scale. Remember, it is 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 1, the very sad one. Now, what happens if we raise that 6th? Watch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Da-da. We just added the most ridiculously happy interval in music into the minor scale. It's like putting, sugar on your sauerkraut. All of a sudden, we've got this really kind of sweet and sour thing going on. For example, that 6th interval, let me prove my point. If you put that into a chord, we get a 6th chord. All like Hawaiian music and happy swing music loves 6th chords because the interval of the 6th is extremely happy. Now we have the saddest of all scales, the natural minor, with the happiest of all intervals, the major 6. And we get this flavor. So I call it minor light. It's still kind of sad, but it's also kind of folksy and upbeat. And that's why so many folk songs love to write melodies with their voice that use that, Shady Grove, my little love, Shady Grove, I know, Shady Grove, my little love, Shady Grove. That's a Dorian song, okay? But the sound is cool, man. Because up here it almost sounds Mixolydian. But now it gets minor. So that's a fun one. The Dorian is like a minor light. Okay? Now, the Lydian. Disclaimer, the Lydian and the Phrygian and the Locrian you'll never use, at least not in any jam with normal people. These might come up at 3 a.m. around the campfire if someone is playing A minor to F over and over again and no one seems to be able to get him to stop. Then you could probably employ the Lydian or the Phrygian scales. These technically are going to be brought up again in my category called exotic scales because they're used in flamenco and modern jazz and stuff like that. So the Lydian is a modern jazz scale. It sounds like outer space music. A lot of composers who write science fiction or space movies, the soundtracks, they use the Lydian mode. Pink Floyd liked the Lydian mode. Joe Satriani, the album Surfing in a Blue Dream, a lot of that was the Lydian mode. So let me demonstrate. We take a major scale and we sharp the 4th. That's really messing with stuff right there. 1, 2, 3, not here, we sharp it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. does, since it takes away the fourth is the main place we want to go in music, G to C. Now we can't do that. So now the whole scale floats. Watch. Notice how even though I ended on that G root, we don't feel like it resolved. It's unresolved. So a lot of, for example, Pink Floyd. That sound is the Lydian sound. It's real kind of floaty and spooky outer space. The Phrygian is really also called the Spanish gypsy sometimes, or the flamenco scale. You take a natural minor and you flat the second. On the other side of the world, we hear a lot of flat seconds. In Western music, for some reason, when we leave the front door of our root, we have to take a big step. We want to go 1, 2, 1, 2. We can't even imagine the idea of not taking a big step to launch our scale. Almost all Western scales, the first step is a whole tone, okay? As soon as you flat that first step, that second, it takes you over to the Eastern culture. See, now we have that really interesting snake charmer sound. Just by moving one note on a minor scale. And I've thought about that, like, it really changes things. Maybe it's because it's upside down. We love to resolve up to the root from that leading tone. Or a lot of like Middle Eastern music likes to resolve down to the root from that flat too. It's just another way to get in the door. It's really interesting. So now we take our minor scale, we flat the 2. Once again, it sounds like flamenco or Middle Eastern music. Then I'm going to have a very brief discussion on the Locrian, because I don't find it that useful. Strangely enough, heavy metal musicians like it. People with hair issues like it. Basically, everything is flatted except too much hair is what I'm trying to say. Flatted except the root and the fourth. And it sounds like an extremely dissonant, really creepy, dark, scary scale. It's flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 7. I kind of don't like it. It's just a little too sour for me, okay? Move on to page 2, please. And we're going to talk about synonym modes. You will read, once again, in classical theory books about the Ionian mode and the Aeolian mode. And so other music teachers don't leave snarky comments when I put this on YouTube. I'm going to have to cover myself and say, yes, I know those are called modes, people, but you can't argue with the fact that the Ionian mode is the same as the major scale and the Aeolian mode is the same as the natural minor. And that's facts, and that's science, and you can prove that. Some people like to say, I'm going to play the Aeolian mode on blah, blah, blah. No, just say you're playing a natural minor scale, okay? There's no need to be pretentious unless you're getting paid. So those are synonyms. Now, number E, using borrowed scales. This is something you can use. Now, this is a hands-on concept in the class. If we're playing a G Mixolydian, which is a G with a flat 7, if you think about it long enough, you'll notice that that's exactly all the same notes as a C scale. Just starting from G. Oh, wow. So I could just play C scales over a song that's in G and kind of make sure I hit a lot of G notes and not give it away, and I'll create a Mixolydian scale. So you can do the borrowed scale formula to easily find those modes. So for the Mixolydian, you play out of the 4. That's why I said if you're in G, you go up 4 steps. Now remember, it's going to be major scale steps whenever we use a theory formula. It's from the major scale. If you want to find the Dorian, play out of the flat 7. So if the song's in G, you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, flat it. That's an F. Play F major scales over a song in G and you get G Dorian. It's a good hack. I do that a lot. Okay. Now let's look at synthetic scales. These are primarily the chromatic and the whole tone, the diminished and the half diminished. I covered this for theory reasons because they exist and I left them out. Like I said, someone would call me on it. The most useful are the chromatic, which uses all notes. And once again, I'm not teaching how to use that in improv, but I'll just say very quickly, that's a good, powerful spice. It's like cayenne. So if I'm playing and I want to get attention, here we go. It's an attention getter. It's like a little bit of cayenne in there for a minute. So you can use the chromatic scale a lot in your improv, okay? And then the whole tone is really weird. I learned it melodically once. It's floaty. There's no... I don't think I would use that. I mean, what if you did it with Blackberry Blossom? It's really it's inappropriate. So it's not terribly useful unless you're playing jazz. That's in the field of jazz, where you want to have that floaty sound. Exotic scales are the Mixolydian Pentatonic. I love this scale. That's where you take a Mixolydian, which as we just learned is a major scale with a flat 7. Get this. And you take out the 2 and 6, and you make a pentatonic scale out of the Mixolydian mode. Now we're getting heavy. Okay, now this is deep. But bear with me, because the scale that results is super cool. Now we have 1, 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 1. It's the sitar scale. The Beatles used it all the time. John McLaughlin, a lot of progressive, like trance people use it. It's a handy scale, and you can actually use it in bluegrass, believe it or not. It's a neat flavor. That's very usable. That's very usable. Okay, then exotic scale number 2, the Phrygian. Is the Phrygian mode we talked about. The Spanish Gypsy is you take the Phrygian scale, which was the minor with the flat 2nd, and we raise the 3rd. Now that's really confusing because we got that flat 2nd, but the happy major 3rd. Super exotic. Once again, that's a 3 a.m. scale when people are smoking something beside corn husk. But it's good to know about, okay? And then we have what's called the Ponilic, which I like, and that is the Spanish Gypsy with the raised 7th. We're getting too deep here. I'm about to backpedal, but we play the Spanish Gypsy scale, and we sharp the 7. Darn it. Wild. It's a wild flavor. And then we have, which I just added this because I like it. There's a classic Japanese song called Sakura, meaning I believe cherry blossom. And it's based on this scale, which is 1. Let's see. It's a natural minor without the 4 and 7. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 1. Wild. Interesting. I don't know how useful that is, but it's fun to play with. The formula's on page 3. Now, let's review the 5 must-have scales. We're going to come up for air now, and item 3 on page 2 is how you're going to keep yourself from plummeting into a bleak depression over all these scales that are out there. Major and natural minor, pentatonic major and minor, modern blues, Mixolydian and Dorian, and chromatic. In fact, of those, go ahead and mark, I want you to underline pentatonic major and minor, modern blues, and Mixolydian. That's all you need to get through life right there, really, because you don't even need the major scale, really. And you certainly don't need the natural minor. The pentatonic major and minor are way more useful for jamming, okay? And the modern blues is just such a badass scale, pardon my French. such a mean scale. It's just, that's the modern blues scale. It's just a mean scale. By the way, all of this stuff I'm talking about applies to all instruments. I chose to put on a banjo today as opposed to a musical instrument because I didn't want to be like grabbing stuff up. But it applies to everything. So mandolin, ukulele, whatever. Just bear in mind, this theory applies to all instruments. And it applies to all keys. What key do you get when you drop a piano down a mine shaft? A flat minor, of course. So now we've covered item 3, which is, I know, sad. Now let's go to 4 on page 2, harmonic side of scales. So it's so easy to think of the beads on a string model, okay? But remember, in this dimension in which we exist, this world of form, there's only 2 ways you can have notes occur. Either in a row, like ants on a log, or together, stacked up as in a chord. In linear time, they can only go one after another or all at the same time. And in music theory, we call one after another, like scales, we call that melodic theory. And if they're all at the same time, as in a chord, we call that harmonic theory. So there is a harmonic theory to scales. And it's very useful for the musician. And here's why. If you take a scale and you basically analyze each note, they call that an interval. So like, let's do a major scale. Here's the 1, here's the 2, right? What if I played them at the same time? That's called the interval of a second. It's kind of a horn sound. Now I'm going to go to the 3rd. What if I play the 3rd and the root together? That's the interval of the 3rd. That's the most satisfying, correct tone in our music. It's like the main harmony. Now we go to the 4th. The 4th is called a perfect interval in old theory because it sounds very strong. It's very strong sounding. Now we go to the 5th, also called a perfect 5th because very, very strong. A lot of rock and roll musicians love that interval. They play it. They take the 3rd out of their chords. It's called a power chord, and it's just a root and a 5th and another root. It sounds like this. And that's what like heavy metal and hard rock people do. They play the 5th interval. Okay. Now we take the 6th interval. That's that one I said was super happy and fluffy. Okay. The major 7th interval, kind of discorded, but if you put it in a chord, all of a sudden it's Steely Dan, or Steely Dan in an elevator, which is where you'll most likely hear it nowadays. So it's fun to think about each note of the scale played at the same time with the root. That's called interval theory. Then we have harmonized scales. Take a note of this. Every note in the scale can become a chord. Then you have a scale that's made out of chords. That's so useful. It's called a harmonized scale. Remind me in your personal lessons to learn the harmonized scale, at least for the key of G, the G major scale. Because now we have G. Instead of G, A, it's going to be G major, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor, F sharp, half diminished 7th. I'll tell you why when you're older, and G. Okay? So there's your harmonized scale in G. It's so cool. It's cool for improv. I can use it in my playing, you know? It's, oh man. It's like a really powerful tool for improv. And once again, that's discussed in the improv class. I'm not getting too deep into that today. More importantly, when you harmonize a scale, it shows you your chord families. If you don't have the chord family chart, make sure you go to my resources link and go to ebooks and charts, and there's a chart down there that's called the chord families. Basically, in a word or two, certain chords go together. Everybody knows G, C, and D sound good together. That's because those chords are found on the 1, the 4th note of the scale, and the 5th note of the scale. Wow, light bulb. Some of you have heard about people use numbers instead of chord letters. They'll say, this song goes 1, 4, 5. That's why. They're referring to scale tones. Okay? Really handy to know. So if you harmonize a scale, and you have to only use the notes within that scale. So if I'm going to build a G scale off a G note, and all chords are 1, 3, and 5, there's your instant harmonic lesson, 1, 3, and 5. So I'm going to go 1, and my 3 is right there, and my 5 is right here, so it's going to be a G major. When I go up to A and make an A chord, it can't be an A major because there's no C sharp in the key of G. So that's going to have to be an A minor. That's going to have to be a B minor because there's no D sharp to make it a B major. See what I mean? It's called diatonicism. We're staying diatonic or true to the structure of this scale. If you learn your harmonized scales, you'll all of a sudden know all the chords that go with a song or a key. I made that easier in the Chord Families chart where I just show you in G you have G, C, and D, 1, 4, and 5 for the major chords, and then you have E minor, B minor, F sharp minor, or half diminished, and those are your secondary chords. That's also in one of the workshops. But just take this away. Scales can be used to build chords, and scales can be played as a series of chords. That's a harmonized scale. Okay? Let's talk about use of scales in real life. Here's where I just leave it open-ended. Number 1. Well, there's 3 reasons: for theory, for practice, and for improv. Other than being a convenient place to store and organize notes, there's 3 reasons that they exist. So for theory, what I just mentioned, you can find your chord families. You can use a scale as a template. Let's say I want to write a banjo tune or a mandolin or fiddle tune. I want it to be a happy tune. I'm going to use the G pentatonic scale. And I have a little ditty that sounds happy because I used the G pentatonic major scale as my template. I should have put that word in there. Using them as a template for composing. I want something darker. I'm going to write a tune using the Dorian scale. Okay. Just a little instant tune there. That had a sort of a minor sound, but also kind of light because it was based on the Dorian. So knowing these scales can give you a template to write tunes, and that's amazing. That's an amazing advantage, okay? And then for practice, scales are like a treadmill. I'm going to the workout, a gym or something, which I haven't been to for over a year, so I'm not going to discuss that. But we use that to improve what I call the 4 T's: technique, tone, timing, and tempo. And I'll go really brief over the 4 T's because that should be on your wall somewhere. Technique on a scale is to make sure we're not tied in knots and we have the proper fingering. Okay? Tone means I'm not muting anything, or I don't sound too sharp or too soft. I have a nice tone. Okay? Timing is the fact that I'm not rushing and slowing down. I have a nice even timing. And finally, tempo is, can I play it fast and slow? How fast can I play it? It's not important to play fast, but if you want to, scales can get you there. Okay? And finally, this is the subject that I said several times I'm not going to dive into. That's why I left it for the very end of the class. Scales are used or should be used for improvising. That's really what you want to do with all these scales. And those of you who have taken lessons with me know that I use some techniques. I use what I call the 3 R's, and I use what I call left-hand ornaments. So I'll give a really brief demo of that because most of you heard about this already from me. The 3 R's are repeats, rests, and rhythms. I should start with rests, actually. They're the most important. So I'm playing my scale, my G major scale. I start adding in little rests. And all of a sudden, just the fact that we poked holes in it makes it start to sound more musical and sound like you're improvising. Okay? The second R, repeats, is probably the most cosmic tool there is. If you repeat 2 or 3 or 4 notes in a row, it sounds like you're saying something. And once again, I've said many times, I don't know why. If I did, I'd write a book and go on Oprah. I just know that it does work. So, for example, wow, that's a song already. I just repeated the first three notes of the major scale. I don't know why it works. I just know it works. And finally, rhythms means vary the rhythm in your scale playing. Make sure you go slow, medium, and fast. Now that's a simplification, but it does help to think of the three tempos, or I like to say slow, medium, and bluegrass. And so we have our beat. I'm being slow. Medium. Fast. So now I have more colors available to me. And then we have slides and hammers and pull-offs and bends and vibrato, or as I call it, the wiggle. And we add those in, mixed with the 3 R's, and now our scales have been smashed with a hammer and turned into sparkling clouds of notes, which now it's music, because it's not just beads on a string, like we said at the onset. So here would be an example of, I like to say it out loud. Repeat. Rest, 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 repeat. Rest, rest, beat. Pull off. Slide. Pull up. Bend. Vibrato. And you can actually like force yourself to add those into your scale. Okay? Mind-blowing. Like I said on the onset, there's more scales out there than on a 15-foot python. But once you boil it down, they become fascinating and, imagine that, useful. Okay? So we've got about 5 minutes, and I love to always conclude the classes to allow people to ask some questions, as long as they're not about my personal life. So does anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question about the subject we've discussed? If not, no problem, no pressure. But if you want to do that, now would be the time. Otherwise, forever hold your peas. Hey, I knew it would be you, Lupo. You trouble causer. What's going on?
Well, I feel older now, so I kind of want to know why the
I told you that was going to happen.
why the seventh interval when you're playing chord scales is a half diminished seventh.
Oh God. First of all, on the getting older bit, the number one strategy is just don't get born so soon.
Okay, I'll try better.
Since we all kind of failed on that one. Because it's the, oh God, you're going to make me explain this. It's diatonic theory. So if we're building a 4-note chord.
If the scale notes, all the notes are in that scale.
Yeah. So the last I left you with was a triad, harmonizing the triad, moving up the scale. You can also harmonize scales in 4-note quadrads. So major 7, minor 7, minor 7, major 7, dominant 7, minor 7, and all of a sudden, when you harmonize this leading tone in a major scale with a quadrad, it's forced into a shape that theory calls a minor 7 flat 5.
Cool.
Okay? And that's because it's a minor 7, but that 5th degree has been flatted to kind of be molded into the diatonic structure of the G major scale. So, in summary, the 7th, the chord built on the 7th of a major scale is called a minor 7 flat 5, also known as a half diminished 7th, because when you build a 4-note chord on that interval and you stay diatonic, that's what emerges.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Also, just put this in your pipe and spoke too, since you started this. A lot of times, instead of the minor 7 flat 5 based on the leading tone, we will use that as a substitute for the dominant 7th based on the 5th. Okay, but I am not explaining that. That's just something to cause you to toss and turn at night. So this has been really, really fun. I enjoyed the heck out of this. Please email me afterwards with questions. I love to hear from you guys. What am I doing today? I'm going to do some gardening and putting around and doing a bunch of banjo arrangements for students. So I'm around. So hit me up, and I will see you all at your classes coming up. And I really appreciate you making time today. I love these groups, man. It's really fun. And have a great weekend, boys and girls. We'll see you next time.